I want to start with this really good Gramsci quote. Um, it is essential to destroy the widespread prejudice that philosophy is a strange and difficult thing just because it is the specific intellectual activity of a particular category of specialists or professional and systematic philosophers. It must first be shown that all people are philosophers by defining the limits and characteristics of the spontaneous philosophy which is proper to everybody. So, the task of this presentation is to, in the clearest possible terms, illustrate two things. What is the meaning of dialectics, and further, what is specifically materialist dialectics? We shall assume the audience has no training in philosophy, and we shall assume the audience has only loosely, sporadically talked or read about dialectics in general. In order to begin demystifying dialectical thought, which is arguably the ultimate demystifier, I would like to spend a minute or two discussing why it is so important to study and think about dialectical materialism in the first place. I would like to start with one example as a primer. Kautskiists in the DSA argue for gradual, slow reform, that the conditions for proletarian power must ripen on their own. The dialectic teaches us that change happens in sudden, massive, qualitative leaps, meaning opportunists misunderstand the very manner in which change occurs. They disempower the working class, and instead of heightening class consciousness and heightening the contradictory forces at play, which we aim to do by being a class that is conscious of itself as a class, they merely leave the working class as passive receptacles to the things that happen to them, waiting on the world to change, as John Mayer unfortunately sings. Initially, we can say that the dialectical method is the active process by which we come to know reality itself, and from that can change it. A proper grasp on ideas and the dialectic can then serve as a solid, firm basis from which we can come to our principles. Principles can never be left to sheer whim or what we often call our free will. If we cannot solidly defend our ideas, what actually makes us different from the opportunists who reactively decide which principle they will wear on any given day, as if principles were no different than the clothes in our closet? To be as clear and brute as it can be, dialectical materialism serves as the way in which we must comprehend reality itself, in order to serve as a basis from which to act and to guide us in understanding our present conditions. We cannot do this by simply observing the world around us. As our comrades Harrison Fluss and Landon Frim, in their incredible article Reason as Read, stated, facts do not speak for themselves. As they argue, and so would I, we must actively comprehend facts, systematize them, and ultimately draw conclusions ourselves. Marxists have attempted to wield dialectical materialism in order to understand how things change. As Marx said, man makes history, he just doesn't know it. The point of dialectical materialism is to know how things change in order to consciously change them. The rest of this talk will draw mainly from Trotsky's ABCs of materialist dialectics, and though it was not assigned, I do use a little bit of Engels' socialism, utopian and scientific. I will do my best to summarize and introduce the idea of dialectics and material dialectics, but please note that dialectical thought is something hard fought through study and debate. It is not ready-made. I cannot tell you, here is the great dialectical formula from above which will unlock the mysteries of the universe. And neither has this ever been the case, even with Hegel, that dialectical thought is a rigid dogmatic program by which everything follows the exact same steps, such that all things are reducible to a simple linear progression. I hope here you can see or hear the parallels in Menshevik and opportunist thought. I believe the miserable term thesis, antithesis, synthesis is what people think Hegel said of dialectics. He never did, not even once. Hegel, across most of his writings and lectures, stresses the importance of not making dialectical thought into a dead, static formula, something we can simply apply to our world without critically thinking. I would like to say that critical thinking isn't merely the act of pointing out a critique of any given thing. Dialectical materialist thought can deduce and demonstrate the very categories of human thought which humans both have and are structured by. And here's, unfortunately, a really good list from Hegel. Being, becoming, quantity, quality, finitude, infinity, determination, and also the very things we organize around and fight for, chiefly among them freedom. Freedom is a category of thought which has no direct solid object we can perceive, but it is one of the central categories and ideas of Marxists. The task of learning dialectical materialism is the task of learning how to think. As Hegel aptly points out in many of his texts, it is not that those uninitiated to philosophy cannot philosophize, it's that they philosophize, but they don't even know it yet. Thought is alienated from us as workers, and the task for us then is to overcome the alienation from philosophy, especially as communists and organizers. We must not let the contradiction between manual and intellectual labor stand. Philosophy is universal because we are all structured by being, which also structures our thoughts. And as a truly final note, a truly final note I want to make, thinking is not reducible to consciousness or our experiences. In fact, dialectical thinking trades in things which we cannot perceive with our senses. Like the categories above, can you taste quality? Can you see being? How does one conceive of matter? These categories are to be worked out in thought because they have no direct object to confront us with in our experiences. They are objects of thought, and they are ideas, but that is no reason to be allergic to them. In fact, that's all the more reason to think properly. As Trotsky notes, dialectical thinking is, quote, dialectical thinking, quote, analyzes all things and phenomena in their continuous change while determining the material conditions of those changes. He begins this essay with what is an admittedly confusing argument. While I'm no logician, we must note that all one needs to understand about an Aristotelian syllogism is that it's a static, unchanging axiom, which is also known as an assumed truth. We find this when Trotsky talks about A being equal to A, or A is A. Natural and intuitive, right? Trotsky says no, this is actually not the case. No A is ever equal to any other A. The literal printed A on a page is not equal to another. Neither is any brass casing, pound of sugar, or any good made by a worker, something Trotsky says workers already know. One could easily say, well, something is equal to itself at any given moment. Trotsky calls this person a sophist, and a sophist is the traditional intellectual enemy of the philosopher. They were paid teachers in ancient Athens who, as Socrates described, sought to always make the weaker argument stronger, meaning they have no relationship to the truth. As Trotsky notes, how should we really conceive the word moment? No matter how small you slice down a moment, the object you're analyzing will change. And if you want moment to mean the 0 point in time or outside of time, then you won't really understand your object because all things are subjected to time. What seems to be a common, concrete analysis of a thing turns into its exact opposite. By trying to understand an object outside context, outside the whole, and even outside time, you aren't really understanding your object at all. Trotsky rightly points out that the A equals A is fine to say in certain limited contexts. It is both the foundation of knowledge and the foundation of the errors of knowledge, precisely because it cannot comprehend the dialectical leap from quantity to quality. Lower level, basic logic is static. It does not move. It works in axioms which are inflexible and unbending. Quote, but quantitative changes beyond certain limits become converted into qualitative. A pound of sugar subjected to the action of water or kerosene ceases to be a pound of sugar. To determine at the right moment the critical point where quantity changes into quality is one of the most important and difficult tasks in all the spheres of knowledge, including sociology. That's from Trotsky. I don't want to get caught up too much on what we mean by quantity and quality. Maybe an example he uses later is helpful. We know certainly, even using empirical science, that consciousness is a product of that which is unconscious. The material of our brains and body are not conscious in the sense of forming concepts and thoughts, but our thoughts and concepts depend on them. Consciousness arises from unconsciousness. Dialectically speaking, it is quite literally the sheer quantity of unconscious matter in human physiology which gives rise to the qualitative shift allowing consciousness to arise. I would argue this is a case in lots of different animals as well. A qualitative shift literally changes the essence of a thing while also preserving what gives rise to it. We still need a body and brain to have consciousness. Or another example from Trotsky, and one that I love, given that I'm a huge film nerd, dialectical thinking is related to vulgar thinking in the same way that a motion picture is related to a still photograph. The motion picture does not outlaw the still photograph, but combines a series of them according to the laws of motion. And finally, to clear up anything about quantity and quality, I'm lifting directly from the glossary and Engel's anti-Düring. There are times, however, when the amount of change in a thing changes its very character. For example, if the book was reduced to one page, it is no longer a book. When change affects the very character of the thing, a qualitative change has occurred. Dialectics illustrates how and when a change occurs in a given thing or context, such that we can identify when it has become something else. Later in his piece, Trotsky illustrates why this is important. It guides us to see when a bourgeois state becomes a worker state and when a worker state ceases to be a worker state. I would highly recommend reading State and Revolution on this because Lenin is applying materialist dialectics when he also talks about the lower and higher phases of socialism. Maybe now we can hazard a more solid definition of dialectics. It is the laws and logic of motion of our thoughts as they mirror reality as reality truly is. But what could make this materialist? Trotsky says, since our dialectics roots are neither in heaven nor in the depths of free will, but in objective reality in nature. What he means here is that dialectical thought is not something we simply dream up. It is not something handed down from on high, and it is not something we feel or simply have faith in. It is real. It exists independently of us. Or as he says, quote, the dialectic of thinking, having grown out of the dialectic of nature, possesses consequently a thoroughly materialist character. Just as consciousness arises from that which is unconscious, dialectical thought grows out of the dialectic of nature. But as critical thinkers, it would be incumbent upon us to ask, how does something being in or from nature make it inherently materialist? Given that we can appeal to nature for all sorts of wild mystical schemes, how can it be the case that appealing to nature guarantees a materialist perspective? Saying nature is materialist skirts the issue, as the matter at hand truly is, the question, what is matter? We have now breached some metaphysical depths, potentially outside the scope of this talk. Suffice it to say, a robust argument would need to be made to define matter properly. I recommend, again, the article Reason is Read. For the purposes of this talk, what Trotsky means by materialist is that dialectical materialism is the very manner in which nature evolved to become humanity. Human thought is not separate or independent from reality. Human thought is also structured by reality. Or, as Marx says in German ideology, it is consciousness that determines life. It is not consciousness that determines life, not consciousness that determines life, but rather life which determines consciousness. For dialectical thought to be materialist, I think what Trotsky means is that it must illustrate how human thought itself arises and situates human thought within the larger whole. Trotsky then pivots to a discussion on the leaps made in scientific inquiry in many fields. What he is saying is that though the thinkers themselves did not recognize their ideas as dialectical, whole fields of inquiry, in a sense, discovered or illustrate dialectical thought. In Darwinian evolution, quantitative changes in species result in qualitative leaps. Elements can transform into different elements. And Marx added the dialectical dimension to sociology and the study of societies. No longer can we conceive of societies in a purely descriptive way, but in a dynamic way, one which points out class struggle, the contradiction in production, and how societies can change. What this all means is that our thought must conform to the motion inherent in reality itself. Engels says something similar in his Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Quote, in this system, dialectical materialism, and herein is its great merit. For the first time, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, i.e., as in constant motion, change, transformation, development. And the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. I should note here, too, that our comrade Steve Lee, in his article on Firebrand's website, says as much in his great piece on dialectical thought. I should add a secondary definition to dialectical thought as well. Dialectical materialist thought is systematic, or it systematizes, because it fundamentally illustrates that the part, or something singular or individual, only makes sense within the context of a larger whole. Or, as the talk or podcast that was recommended for tonight as well also says, taken, for example, taken in isolation, the lungs and heart don't really make sense. You even need to add in the concept of blood and with it circulation and oxygen to truly understand those organs. In that talk, he kind of mentions this notion of the part and the whole, and I really like the example of the lungs and the heart because you kind of need the two together to understand what they do. You can't just like rip someone's heart out and be like, how does it work? You need the rest of the body to make sense of the heart and lungs. Um, so too, can we apply that to society itself? The position of the worker under capitalism only makes sense within the larger totality that is capitalism. And when we recognize ourselves as workers, we understand what causes our immiseration and the crises that we are so prone to being subjected to. Then can we begin to grow our consciousness and change our position? I fear my talk has stayed at the realm of the abstract and unspecific. Trotsky rightly notes that dialectical materialism's power comes not from merely being a tool for building the consciousness of the worker, but its power comes from identifying what is specific and concrete of any given social formation. For example, it's not that our analysis of capitalism is static and ready-made, or left at the register of the concept of capitalism in general, but, quote, a given capitalism at a given stage of development. Trotsky ends his piece with a few meditations on the nature of the USSR and evolution and dialectics. He points out that the contradiction within the USSR should be our starting point of our analysis. At risk of inciting a discussion exclusively about state capitalism, I would just like to say that Trotsky in this piece is merely pointing out that the contradiction between the bureaucratic caste and the social basis of the revolution, by which I think he means the Soviets and workers' democracy, is the point at which struggle could have worked to overthrow the bureaucracy. That in using dialectical materialism, it is possible to pinpoint the contradiction of a society in order to overthrow its social order. I think one of the most important arguments in Trotsky's piece is that, quote, a real evolutionist must apply the idea of evolution to his own forms of thinking. I think we can phrase this as this. Dialectical materialism will continue to evolve and grow as reality evolves and grows, as does humanity, and as does humanity's forms of thinking. This is a plea for us to not only study what has been said and argued for, but to be constantly vigilant and robust enough in our thinking to evolve as reality evolves. Or, quote, whatsoever has come to understand that evolutionary process through the struggle of antagonistic forces, that a slow accumulation of changes at a certain moment explodes the old shell and brings about a catastrophe, revolution. But this is only possible if we really come to know dialectical thought in all its facets. It is not simply looking and observing for new things. As I said above, dialectics works in things beyond human experience, i.e., categories of thought. And it is not the case that experience and facts are true guides to understanding our situation. They must be systematized, critiqued, debated, and overturned. I hope to have made a small contribution to our group in understanding dialectical materialist thought. There was much I left out, particularly the concept of contradiction. We could spend years discussing this. I also did not illustrate nor demonstrate the logical rigor required of dialectical thought. In summary, dialectical materialism is the form of thought for Marxists to use because it grasps reality itself in its dynamism, in its specificity, and in its contradictions. It is revolutionary because dialectical materialism understands how change itself occurs, from natural phenomena all the way from human thought to human societies. It is material because it is fundamentally based in nature itself. Or, as I would add, it captures the truth of reality itself. As Trotsky says, it's important for us to understand dialectical thinking because dialectic training of the mind as necessary to a revolutionary fighter is as necessary to a revolutionary fighter as finger exercises to a pianist, demands approaching all problems as processes and not as motionless categories. What's at stake is both simple and vastly complex. Understanding the processes of reality itself and wielding that to smash the bourgeoisie and bring about an international socialist movement.